in February this year.
Ramaphosa is expected to meet his counterpart, Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari, in Abuja, Nigeria's capital. It is expected discussions between both leaders will be aimed at bolstering economic ties among two of Africa's largest economies, despite diplomatic relations having been strained recently.
Some analysts argue that the discussions may be centered on the 39 trillion rand Continental Free Trade Zone agreement, which is still pending.
Well, to talk more on the illicit financial flows out of the continent, South Africa's political economy and relations between South Africa and Nigeria in light of President Cyril Ramaphosa's working visit to that country, we are now joined on the line by the Director of Political Economy in Southern Africa, Siya Beniza. A very good evening to you, Mr. Beniza. Thank you so much for joining us now. Nigeria and South Africa have got the biggest economies on the continent. So how have economic relations between the two been in the last couple of years? I mean, the working visit by Mr. Ramaphosa is expected to deal largely with trade relations between the two.
Yes, I think the countries have got quite a strong competitive relations with one another, knowing that just a few years ago, after rebasing its GDP, Nigeria took over the first spot in terms of the biggest economy on Africa from South Africa. But in recent years, diplomatic relations have been very strained, as you've also seen in terms of some of the retaliation and the protests that have happened both in Pretoria but as well in Lagos following the xenophobic attacks that started in 2014. But more recently, with the signing of the Continental Free Trade Area, these two giants of the African economy are most likely meeting to discuss how they can balance some of these competing relations with one another, but also encourage intra-Africa trade and regional industrialization on the continent, given that although South Africa is lagged behind in terms of second or third place in terms of the size of the economy, it still is the most industrialized economy on the continent, whilst Nigeria being the largest. And so the countries have got a few things to learn from one another, but more importantly, they need to cooperate in order to make sure the success of the Continental Free Trade Area.
And having said that, how great an influence do diplomatic relations have on trade relations?
I think very, very significant, as you can also see in terms of the retaliation and the response that the Nigerian government has had on South African firms doing business in Nigeria, such as the fine against MTN, although might have not been related to the diplomatic relations, some of these challenges of doing business abroad can be resolved at the diplomatic level without having to impose fines or punitive action, as we've seen. And so these diplomatic ties, resolving some of the issues, is very critical to ensuring and encouraging a equal or level sort of business environment that encourages cross-trade in both directions, in Nigeria from South Africa and in South Africa from Nigeria, I mean.
Now, Siya, we all know that, there are quite interesting contrasts in the domestic political environments of both countries that inform and determine their foreign policy decisions. How do both parties move beyond such contrasts and differences in order to bolster, to bolster relations?
I think the most significant thing is to agree on regional or continental value chains that the two countries want to promote. Obviously, by creating a continental free trade area, we're now sort of encouraging intra-Africa trade. But beyond that, what we want to get is to encourage or to allow both environments to be conducive to investment. And that's really the crux of what the discussions and the negotiations are about. And so once countries have agreed on the value chains that they want to promote and how they will benefit, given the large scale of the informal sector in Nigeria and a largely formal economy in South Africa, the countries will then be able to cooperate and integrate in one another in continental value chains, because in the current era, production doesn't necessarily take place in one country and inputs come from multiple countries. And so what African countries want to promote is sourcing of inputs from one another and encouraging at least some level of production, depending on the capacity that each country is at, in order to underpin that regional and continental trade and promote regional continental industrialization.
Let's talk about the barriers to entry, or rather barriers to trade in both markets. Is it easy for South African businesses, to conduct businesses on either countries?
Well, given the similar legal system, although the countries are different in that Nigeria is a federal state and South Africa being a republic, the legal similarities do encourage and enable cross-border trade or business to be conducted in foreign environments. But the problem is also adjusting for South African firms into the local market in Nigeria. Given the significance of the informal market, I think the informal market is somewhere between 50 to 65% of domestic production in Nigeria, whereas in South Africa, we have a largely negligible informal sector. And so when South African firms are in Nigeria, they have to grapple with the realities of that market, but also integrate some of the producers and suppliers from Nigeria in order to create a mutually beneficial relationship. But what we've also seen outside of sort of formal trade and business is a rising importance of South Africa as part of investment in Nigeria. There are a number of investments, both driven by private sector and the public sector in infrastructure, that are also critical to ensuring that the countries get to a level playing ground, at least in terms of their industrial capacity or productive capacity, such that the trade between each other is relatively mutually beneficial. Because whilst if Nigeria remains as a largely informal sector without very little industrial capacity domestically, the relations between South Africa and Nigeria will continue being relatively unequal, and the gains from the trade won't encourage continued interaction between the countries. And so when the countries come closer in terms of the industrial capacity, then they maximize the mutual benefit from the international trade as well as business across border.
And it looks as if President Ramaphosa is on a charm offensive and reaching out to his neighbors on the continent. Just last week it was Ghana and now it's Nigeria. Does this speak to plans for South Africa's economy in terms of growth and expansion?
Well, given the challenges at a global level, so by and large, the global economy has now moved out of the global recession of 2009, and perhaps the most recent negative shock was the 2014 commodity bust. But now we're entering a stage of trade mistrust. There's talk of a trade war between China and the US. And so the traditional markets that South Africa used to rely on, the EU, the US, are no longer markets that the country can rely on. And this is the same for Nigeria and other African countries. And so what they're finding is the need to look internally because we are also a growing population and a very young population, which provides a huge consumer base. There is a lot of incentive for African countries to trade with one another. And what we're seeing in a shift in the focus from South Africa taking its neighbors on the continent more significantly is as a result of this, finding the need to replace those traditional markets with local emerging markets, both on the continent but elsewhere in the globe, such as Southeast Asia and other regions.
I want to engage you on the South Africa-Nigeria Binational Commission. Do you think that its workings and agendas are aligned in a way, that allows for a deeper, more sustained dialogue covering issues of convergence between both countries?
Well, I'm not so sure about the functionality of the Binational Commission, but usually these binational commissions really just set an environment. These are usually political arrangements and agreements that are intended to encourage and make conducting of business between the countries easier. They don't necessarily result in private investment or increased intra-trade between the countries. And so really, though, the challenge between Nigeria and South Africa trade is as a result of the different industrial capacities in Nigeria compared to what it is in South Africa, but also as a result of the very different type of local market conditions. As a business coming from South Africa, you're used to, a formal market, a competition regulator, etc. Whereas in the Nigerian case, you have a vastly different setup, and there's much more importance of the state vis-a-vis the national or central government. And so these are some of the adjustments that the companies have to do with one another. And I'm not sure that the level of the discussion at the Binational Commission is necessarily taking place at this level, where we can encourage cross-border more, regional or continental value chains amongst the countries, because really this is the way in which business operates these days, as opposed to the old model of producing in South Africa, exporting to Nigeria. What we really want to see is South African firms establishing themselves in Nigeria and also sourcing from Nigeria, but also to see some of the excess capital coming from Nigeria and investing in the formal market in South Africa, both in the real economy as well as the stock exchange.
Now, Sia, as briefly as you possibly can, talk to us about the illicit financial flows out of the continent. I mean, these have for years been flagged as a problem, not only for the individual countries, but the continent as a whole. I mean, recently, Kenya did announce that Switzerland would be returning monies hidden there. And by returning money thought to be the proceeds of crime back to Kenya, it does appear that Switzerland is sending a message that it's no longer a safe haven for money thought to be the proceeds of crime. How did Switzerland become a haven for those illicit funds?
Yeah, look, I think the way in which Switzerland has positioned itself, obviously, is mainly by exploiting its non-obligation to the rest of the world. So it's not part of the EU. It's not really part of any regional bloc that requires it to openly discuss the details and the amounts and assets that its depositors save in the country. Added to that is obviously the benefits in terms of tax with the number of double tax treaties it has. But look, the positive story coming out of Kenya is that misappropriated funds are now being followed after or being recaptured, so to speak. And this is actually a very positive sign on the continent, given the high levels of illicit financial flows that affect Nigeria, particularly because it depends on oil. And even in South African case, where studies have shown over the last decade, between 2000 and 2011, the peaks and averages have been anything between 18 to 25% of GDP in terms of losses in illicit financial flows. But the real challenge of this is the fact that this world operates in a world of confidentiality and hidden information, and it's always very difficult to actually spot out and identify instances of illicit financial flows. And even once that has happened, it's difficult then to track the money, given the confidentiality that countries and financial institutions in Switzerland offer to their depositors. And so this stance being taken by Switzerland is a very positive stance, and I think will be seen in the same light by African governments who lose quite significantly in terms of illicit financial flows.
That's a matter that we'll still be watching closely. And as I said, the confidentiality issue is really is a problem. But then thank you so much for joining us, Sia. We really appreciate your insights. That was Sia Beniza. He's the Director of Political Economy, Southern Africa, PISA, and he joins us via Skype.